Welcome to the pre-concert video for our next concert, featuring the Chamber Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich and the Trumpet Concerto of our composer-in-residence, Marcus Goddard, featuring our principal trumpet player, Ryan Cole. This concert will air on February 4th. Now, there are a number of interesting commonalities between these two pieces, which is kind of a surprise, but pleasant surprise for me because I get to reveal them to you. What does a string orchestra piece from the Soviet Union of 1960 have in common with a trumpet concerto written in Canada in 2018? Well, for starters, both pieces have a sort of a BC connection. In fact, a Vancouver connection. In fact, a Vancouver Symphony Orchestra connection. The Shostakovich Chamber Symphony is an arrangement for string orchestra of his 8th string quartet, and it was made by Russian violist and conductor Rudolf Barshai, who just happened to be the music director of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra from 1985 to 1988. And Marcus Goddard, besides being our composer-in-residence, happens to be the associate principal trumpet player of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. But more than that, these two pieces have another interesting thing in common. They both start with a gesture of just 4 notes, what we call a motif. Now, Shostakovich's 8th string quartet, I'm going to call it that throughout this video, was supposedly written in 3 days. That's an astonishing accomplishment. And it is peppered throughout with a 4-note motif based on the composer's initials. So how does that work? If you remember my video for À la Française 2 concerts ago, the Debussy Ravel concert, I talked about how every culture has discovered the miracle of the octave, that these notes, which I've pictured here, one of which is double the frequency of the other, sound the same to our ears. Every culture has divided this interval differently. We generally divide it into 8 parts, hence the term octave for 8. In the English-speaking world, we assign these 8 notes the first 7 letters of our alphabet, A through G, like so. Our keyboard is arranged so that these notes are found on the white keys. For most melodies and harmonies, you don't need a lot more than these notes, but sometimes you need to use the notes in between these. And we have 2 ways of doing this. A sharp cymbal raises a note, and a flat cymbal lowers it. So depending on whether you're approaching a black key from above or below, it can have 2 different names for the same note. And to notate these on the staff, we put the sharp or flat cymbal to the left of the note. And just to both clear up and add to the confusion, when we don't alter these notes, or when we want to cancel a previous alteration, we give them the designation natural with this symbol. Now, in German-speaking countries, most of Eastern Europe, the Netherlands, sort of, and Scandinavian countries, they also use the letters A through G, but they have 2 really interesting differences. First of all goes back to the early days of music notation. It was mainly used for single-line chants in church music, and you didn't need to use more than just the main letter-named notes, the white keys. The only exception was this note, B. Sometimes we had to alter it, so it didn't make this devilish interval with this note, F, which the prudish folk of the time thought sounded too harsh. Now, before we had all these sharps and flats, we used this symbol to denote the lower B. We called it a soft B, and it corresponds to what we would call in modern times B flat. And this one we used for the higher one, and it's called a hard B. This is actually where our flat and natural symbols came from. Now, when our good German friends wanted to use letters to distinguish the hard B from the soft B, someone, maybe by accident, noted that while the soft B looked a bit like a lowercase b, the hard B looked like a lowercase h. So ever since then, the Germans have called what we call a B flat just B, or B as they pronounce it. And the note we call B natural, they call H, which they pronounce ha. The other interesting thing the Germans did, besides the B and H thing, is they call all their notes by monosyllables. Now for flats they use the suffix s, and for sharps they use the suffix is. So a C sharp is cis, but a D flat is des, a D sharp is dis, an E flat is s, and so on up the scale until you get to be and ha. This comes in really handy when you're naming notes while you sing them, and it gives you some options to spell your name. And of course, a famous example of this is the beloved composer Johann Sebastian Bach. B-A-C-H, B flat, A, C, B natural. In fact, Bach made this cool signature by drawing a note intersecting at the middle of two crossed music staves. He put 4 clefs at the beginning of each line, and depending on the direction you're reading this diagram and what clef you're looking at, the note is simultaneously a B flat, a B, an A, C, and a B natural, or a Ha. B, A, C, Ha. So this is how you spell Dmitri Shostakovich in Russian. So his initials in Russian are D and Sha. In German, his name is phonetically rendered like this, so the initials D and Sha become D, S, C, Ha. In other words, the notes D, E flat, C, and B natural. So that's how Dmitri Shostakovich got his signature motif. So there you go, D-S-C-H. As I said, this motive is found throughout the piece, along with very brief and sometimes very subtle quotes of earlier works of Shostakovich. Sometimes this motif is very somber. In the opening, it's slowly presented by each voice in turn. It's exactly like the way they wrote very early church music. In the scherzo, the theme is transformed into a very lively, yet somewhat mysterious and somber waltz. So it would seem that this work is perhaps autobiographical in a way. Using his own signature and his own music might be Shostakovich's way of telling us something about himself. The work bears a dedication to the victims of fascism, and in particular to the victims of the Dresden bombing during the Second World War. But some people say that this piece is more about Shostakovich himself and his struggles against oppression. Now, it's really difficult to know with Shostakovich. There are people who claim to have known him well, very well, and they often give accounts of his life that are contradicted by other people who also claim to have known him well. Even the members of his own family are sometimes conflicted in their assessment of him. A very popular view of Shostakovich was that he wrote as commentary or protest of a repressive regime, and that this protest was hidden in his music. Never quite so obvious that he'd be caught out by it and that same regime, because there were definite consequences to being caught out by the Soviet regime. There is the fact that he went through a period where he was blacklisted by the regime and then reinstated after his Fifth Symphony. At any rate, I could do an entire hour-long video about that subject, and I wouldn't be the first to do so. But now you know how he got this signature motif, and you can use that in your enjoyment of this work. Now on to our second work, the Trumpet Concerto of Marcus Goddard. This begins with these two four-note motifs. Now you'll notice that one of them rises and one of them falls. It's a very common device in musical rhetoric, almost like a call and response, almost like the cadence of a sentence, like the ones that I'm reading now. He then repeats these four notes. The notes themselves are identical, but now he's shortened the space between them. It gives them a sense of urgency, just as when someone's talking to you and they suddenly speed up what they're saying. He goes on to develop these motifs throughout this movement. They're passed around back and forth between the soloist and the orchestra. In some sections, they're half the speed of the opening. In other sections, you'll hear them buried in much longer and much more complicated passages. The accompanying orchestra, by the way, is just strings and percussion. And the latter, the percussion, is used very effectively throughout this piece. It's a very active percussion part. They present and accentuate as much of the important material in this work as the strings do, so please listen for what they contribute as well. The second movement of this concerto is entitled Vocalise. Now that word literally means a song without a text, just something that you would sing to a neutral syllable. Ryan plays a flugelhorn for this movement. Now flugelhorn is the same length as a trumpet, but it's much more conical in shape, like a horn or a tuba. In fact, as you remember when I talked about the brass last fall, brass players are always divided into two categories. The conical brass are the horns and the tuba, and the cylindrical brass are the trumpets and the trombones. Now, the conical instruments tend to have a darker, more mellow sound, whereas the cylindrical instruments are much more brilliant. I love this second movement. It features this beautiful lyrical line from the flugelhorn, accompanied by a solo violin passage played by our concertmaster, Terry. And it consists of these very rapidly executed broken chords. It's a very meditative passage, and it's in contrast to the frenzy that the outer movements. In fact, the third movement is entitled Propel, and that's exactly what it does. Ryan executes these ascending groups of very, very fast notes, first in groups of 5, then in groups of 4. It's an extremely exciting and very virtuosic last movement for everyone, not just for Ryan. And there's something, to me anyway, that's really satisfying about a trumpet concerto where the final note of the piece also happens to be the highest note of the piece. So anyway, another great program. I hope you enjoy both of these works. Again, if you're watching these videos via the Victoria Symphony website, go over to where they're housed on the YouTube channel and feel free to ask me anything in the comments. Take care, everyone.